Let's get started. Welcome to our weekly speaker series, Saving Life on Earth webinar. I'm Tiara Curry. I'm a senior scientist in our Saving Life on Earth campaign. We're glad that you're here. I know that there's a lot of webinars out there these days, so we're excited that you joined ours. Before we watch this special film tonight about the bees of Grand Staircase-Escalante National Monument, I just want to share a little good news roundup with you about some victories we've had in the past few weeks. Voters in Colorado approved a ballot initiative that will require the reintroduction of gray wolves into the state. And this is very exciting because it will go far in ensuring long-term wolf recovery, getting them back on the landscape in Colorado. The sickle darter, the little fish you see on your screen, and the Canoe Creek clubshell freshwater mussel were proposed for Endangered Species Act protection after waiting for 10 years. We petitioned for their protection a decade ago. So now they're on the road to protection and recovery. In response to a lawsuit from the Center and allies, a federal court suspended construction on the Mountain Valley Pipeline in Virginia and West Virginia because of concerns about pollution from the stream crossings and harm to endangered species. And due to public pressure, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers suspended a key permit for the controversial Formosa Plastics plant in St. James Parish, Louisiana. And California approved regulations to reduce whale entanglements in crab gear. So this is some of our good news from the last 2 weeks. We're going to keep fighting to protect endangered species and to end environmental injustice around the country. And we're so grateful for your help and support in these many battles. This evening, we're going to introduce you to our speakers. Then we're going to watch a 20-minute film together. And then we'll have a discussion about it with the filmmaker and 2 of our staff who work to protect native bees in public lands. Then we're going to save time to answer your questions. So this webinar is going to be 75 minutes instead of 60 because we want to make sure we have time to take your questions at the end. Tomorrow, we'll post a video of the discussion at savinglifeonearth.org. Just scroll down to speaker series. It won't have the film footage. It'll just have the discussion, but you'll get an email right after this webinar with a link that you can watch the video for the next 24 hours, just in case there's an issue with the streaming tonight. The email will also have an action alert with an action that you can take to help protect more habitat for wildlife. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our speakers to introduce themselves. Lori Ann, do you want to go first?
Hi, I'm Lori Ann Burd. I am the Environmental Health Director here at the Center.
Matt, let's meet you.
Hey, my name is Matt Kelly. I am the director and producer of this film. I am also the creator, the host, and the editor of the Bee Report newsletter and podcast.
Taylor.
And I'm Taylor McKinnon, senior campaigner in our public lands program, located in Flagstaff, not too far from the area we'll be talking about tonight, Grand Staircase-Escalante National Monument.
Thank you all for being here. For the next 20 minutes, we're going to watch the film and then we're going to have a discussion with these guys. So Karina's going to stream the film from her computer. That was great. Matt, tell us about this film. What inspired you to make it and what was it like to be out there all the time?
Well, to be out there was astounding. I mean, for anybody who's spent any time in that part of the United States, knows how absolutely magical it is. And I don't use that word lightly. I mean, it's absolutely magical. We mentioned this in the film, the Grand Staircase-Escalante area was one of the last places to be mapped in the United States, which really says something about how distant and how rugged and how pristine this place is. It truly is a frontier and it feels that way, especially when you're on top of that mesa looking out over the world. And it's astounding. It's absolutely astounding. My connection to this happened by chance, and it's a long story that I'll keep short. I happened to get in touch with Joe Wilson for another story I was working on because I do independent journalism in addition to things like this. And he happened to send me at the end of our conversation a map showing the Grand Staircase in comparison to the whole East Coast of the United States, like that map you saw in the film. And realizing that there are almost as many bees, species of bees in this place in southern Utah as there are in the entire eastern United States. It was just incredible. It blew my mind. And that was also at a point where when I thought about bees, I was still thinking about honeybees and bumblebees. And to realize that there were 4,000 types of bees in the United States, honeybees only being one, bumblebees only being roughly 50 types in the United States and North America. To realize that there were so many more types of bees, and that they were solitary, and that they lived in the ground, and that they were most abundant in these desert arid places was just astounding. And then of course you put on top of it the whole adventure of actually trying to get to the top of the mesa. And it's, I mean, how can you not be hooked on something like that and want to make a film?
How do you mentioned honeybees and bumblebees, and people love honeybees. And I just want to give it a shout out to all the people who joined us tonight, because there's more people on this bee webinar than there were on our wolf webinar last week. And wolves usually win the popularity contest hands down. So I'm kind of bowled over by that. But how do you take someone who loves honeybees and get that passion over to native bees?
You know, I think it's a pretty easy, can I make this comparison? Honeybees are the gateway bee. I mean, it really is. I mean, it's really a great place to start. They're most obvious. We know them. They actually produce something that we can eat and we can really connect with, you know, through multiple senses. And I think people get attracted to bees because of just how unique and literally how intelligent they are. And we can do a whole separate conversation about bee cognition, which is astounding. And once you're attracted to that, and you're starting to take the time to just to pause and look and see bees anywhere you can, and you start seeing these new kinds of bees, the blues and the reds and the greens, I mean, if nothing else, they're just visually gorgeous and attractive. Yeah, I think it's a really easy transition to make. But I also think, and this is interesting, I'll get a little wonky on this. You know, one of the things we talk about with honeybees is the concern about spraying pesticides, right? The impact that pesticides have on honeybees and our agricultural systems. Very much a concern. Honeybees can weather some impact from pesticides because they exist as a hive. They kind of exist as this super organism, right? Most bees are solitary. They can't give up 50% of themselves because of impact. And so when we start thinking about things like that, you realize how unique honeybees are and very uncommon from every other type of bee. And then the things we get concerned about with honeybees take on immensely more importance with the solitary bees, who literally, you know, they have one chance to do it right in a season. And if they don't get it right, they're not coming back the next season in a particular area, or it's going to be really hard for them to do that.
So there's so much public understanding that honeybees are in trouble, but you're saying native bees are in even more trouble because they're even more sensitive to environmental threats.
Well, that's what we're trying to discover. And that's why places like Grand Staircase are so vastly important. You know, we have a long cultural history, like from colonial times in the United States, with honeybees. We brought them here. They're livestock. I mean, they're in many ways, they are like cattle or sheep. You know, we raise them on farms in these, you know, large groups to produce food for us or other products for us. So we have a very long history with them, and also we have a very long history of science with them and studying them. We don't have that history with solitary bees, with the vast majority of bees that keep terrestrial ecosystems alive. And it really wasn't until 2007, 2008 that sort of the scientific community had its come to Jesus moment with colony collapse disorder. Suddenly all the honeybees are dying. And, you know, it's like, oh, well, we can just rely on wild bees. What do we know about wild bees? Not that much. And so there's been a flurry of activity over the past, you know, decade and a half to really understand the bulk of the bees that live in our world. And so there's a lot of good work being done. It's, you know, I feel the need to channel the scientists that I know and say, you know, are solitary bees more at risk from these environmental dangers and these environmental impacts? Probably, but we don't know for sure. And again, that's why Grand Staircase and these other places become so important, because they are, one, they're refuges for bees that might not be able to live anywhere else. but two, they provide an extraordinarily powerful comparison point, right? A reference point. We're making changes as humans in the world all the time, and that's going to continue to happen, right? Like we're going to continue to build and want to, have people live and do all these sorts of things. But are we doing it in a way that is nurturing and respectful to the natural world? And the only way we can know that is by preserving pristine places to compare with. What do bees look like in cities and places where we're developing things? And where do they look like in places that remain untouched? And only by having that comparison can we answer those questions.
For sure. And it seems like species that have a small range, they're only there and nowhere else. We're going to have to protect those special places. So
Yeah. I'm
I
sorry, go
just
ahead.
want you to give us a little back scoop on the film. Tell us something that like you wanted to include, but you had to cut, or something interesting that happened while you were filming. I want to know your secrets.
Well, so here is actually probably the most interesting thing about the film. We were scheduled to, again, much like A Solitary Bee, we had one shot at this, right? We did a whole bunch of crowdfunding. I should say that the Center for Biological Diversity also contributed to this film, and I'm totally grateful for that because you guys helped out at a time when we were really getting things off the ground. And so in addition to the great work that you guys do supporting this film, just so gracefully appreciated. So that's my thank you. I want to make sure everybody hears that. But we did our fundraising. We had one shot to get out there and get back. And a lot of that had to do not only with the amount of funding we had, but, Joe and Olivia are parents and their, wives and husbands, and they have families, and it's, you can't just spend all the time in the world. One shot. And we planned to go out 1 week. And then suddenly birthdays and dance recitals came up. So we had to shift it. And that was kind of almost like at the last minute. And it was like, kind of like, oh. But if we hadn't shifted that week, two things would have happened. One, all of our weather would have been rainy and cloudy. We probably wouldn't have seen any bees, and we could not have documented the things we documented. And secondly, we would have missed that road event. We would not have seen that happen. We would not have been able to bear witness to that. And so, it feels weird to say that we were fortunate to have that happen while we were there. But I guess the better way of saying it is that we were fortunate that we were able to be there when it happened. Otherwise, the movie would have been very different. The storytelling would have been very different around this.
Well, that makes sense too, because it's so important that you were there to document it. Or it just would have happened and no one would have known. So
can I throw this in too? Because this is another interesting thing that we didn't get to bring out in the film, and I wish we had talked about more. So the grader comes through, the road gets graded, that Diadasia community gets wiped out. And every time I watch this, I still get choked up when I see Olivia cry. She makes the point that this isn't an endangered bee, right? But it's still extraordinarily sad that it got destroyed. But what's interesting is that it seems simple enough for us that, dude, take the grader, go 5 feet to the left, then come back in, you can avoid this nest, right? The issue is how we define habitat. Roads are not defined as habitat, but everything to the side of the road is. So even if everybody had been on board, even if everybody had said, you know what, you're right, we need to protect this nest, legally, they had to protect the habitat on either side of the road. And so what the movie, what this experience, one of the things that this experience really drove home with me is we need to, again, understand our world so much more so that we can write the rules and the regulations in the correct way to accommodate situations like this. Even if they wanted to shift, they couldn't have, because they would have been destroying what we do consider habitat. And that would have been equally unfair at some level.
A new way of thinking, like making space for other species. I'm
Right.
for it.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, thank you for all of that. I want to shift over to Taylor and have him talk to us about the history of the monument and the efforts to shrink it, and then your work to protect it.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Well, thanks, Tiara, and thanks, Matt, for that beautiful movie. and informative movie, and for your sharing with us about having made it. Very interesting stuff. I'd like to focus a bit on the administrative history of Grand Staircase National Monument, because I'm sure that everyone on this webinar is aware of the Trump administration's attacks on the monument, and I want to give sort of a background on the monument and those attacks and what the center and partners are doing about that. I expect many of you have been to Grand Staircase and are familiar with its spectacular and austere landscape. It's one of the most remote and I think beautiful and surreal landscapes in the American West. And it harbors a tremendous diversity of landforms, spectacular geology, remarkable paleontological history. I think on the Kaiparowits Plateau in the last, I don't know, 20 years, they've found more than 20 new species of dinosaurs, at least new to science. So it provides this remarkable window into the past. It has an incredible human history from archaic up through ancestral Pueblo and Fremont cultures, and evidence of those cultures in rock art panels and habitation sites and other sites in the monument. And it has spectacular biodiversity. The stair steps of the for which the staircase is named, step up as you go northward more than a mile in vertical feet. So you have a huge elevational gradient that drains to the south through these spectacular and biodiverse river systems like the Paria and the Escalante. And all of those things, all of those values, those exceptional values, were in 1996 protected by President Bill Clinton then in a proclamation establishing the Grand Staircase National Monument at about 1.7 million acres. And it was established for the purpose of protecting those values and other values that I just described. And those values are referred to in policy speak as monument objects, and they are described eloquently in the proclamation establishing the monument. And if you haven't read it, I encourage you to read it. You can Google Grand Staircase National Monument Proclamation, and that document spells out the reasons for which the monument was protected. The sort of policy mechanics of a national monument trace back all the way to the Constitution of the U.S., and that the property clause in the Constitution reserves authority for disposal and management of public lands to Congress. So Congress's role, as set forth in the Constitution, is oversight of the federal public lands and whether or not they'll be disposed of, how and how the federal public lands will be managed. And as I'm sure many of you are aware, that management is set forth in the Federal Land Policy and Management Act, and a law that calls for multiple use of the public lands. And that multiple use prior to 1996 did not serve this landscape well. Multiple use policy allows for all manners of extractive uses of the land: livestock grazing, oil and gas leasing, hard rock mining, coal mining, off-road vehicle use, and the history of multiple use on this landscape, had not served this place well, and the Antiquities Act of 1906 provides a sole carve-out for the president from Congress's authority over the public lands, where the president, under the Antiquities Act, can set forth a monument. And so the 1996 proclamation and establishment of Grand Staircase National Monument as a matter of policy took those lands out of multiple use and set them aside under the Antiquities Act for the express purpose of protecting those monuments, those monument objects that are described in the proclamation. We can fast forward to 2017, when soon after the Trump administration had taken power. And one of the first things that the Trump administration did was to issue an executive order 13792, which was a national monuments review. And that was prescribed sort of at the behest of Utah politicians who had long opposed Antiquities Act national monument protections at Grand Staircase. And the review basically called for a review, sorry, my phone is buzzing, called for a review of national monuments less than 20 years old. And that had put a clear target on the back of this monument, Grand Staircase, and also Bears Ears. When the monument review was completed, it recommended the reduction in size of Grand Staircase and Bears Ears, and soon thereafter, President Trump in Salt Lake City held an event and issued new proclamation for the Grand Staircase-Escalante National Monument that would slash its protected acres by 900,000 acres from its original 1.7 million acre boundary. And that, of course, was met with tremendous opposition. It was the most, I think, egregious attack on protected public land in the history of the U.S., in the history of the conservation laws, certainly in the history of the Antiquities Act, and within hours of President Trump signing the new proclamation, effectively trying to sever much of the monument from protection, the center and a number of other organizations sued the Trump administration in federal court. And the central point of that lawsuit was that the Antiquities Act, in the Antiquities Act, Congress granted the president limited authority to declare national monuments and reserve parcels of land as part of national monuments, but Congress did not authorize the president to abolish national monuments in whole or in part once they'd been designated. And only Congress has that power. That lawsuit, let me scroll up here, and sorry. We filed that lawsuit on December 4th, 2017, and it was literally hours after Trump had signed his proclamation. And since that day, it has been working its way through the courts. And today it's fully briefed, which means that both sides, the government and the plaintiffs, have made all of their arguments before the judge, and we're awaiting a decision from the judge. And of course, and I saw a question in the question and answers, what do we expect President Biden to do? Well, President-elect Biden has made a priority to restore the national monuments and that have been severed by Trump, and we will absolutely be encouraging him to do that. So that's a incomplete and brief sketch of the sort of policy history of the national monument and where we stand, and I expect we'll be able to take some questions a bit later.
All right, thank you, Taylor. Let's go over to Lori Ann. Tell us about the native bees and why they're in trouble and your work to protect them.
Sure. So I'll just state the obvious. Native bees are amazing. As we've all seen in the video today, they come in an incredible array of shapes and sizes. They can be the size of a pinhead. They can be a big old bumblebee. There are so many incredible species. In fact, there are 337 species in the US and Canada. And many of them are desperately in need of additional study. So it's a big wide world. You all got a little glimpse at some of the research that's happening on bees in that video. But as you can see, it's just a couple people with some passion getting out there. And a lot of bees are in that situation. A lot of bee species are in the situation of having maybe one or two people in the world who cares about them or even knows their name. Of the bees that we have data for, the best available data tells us that about half of them are declining and about a quarter of them are heading towards extinction. So they need our help if we're going to save them. So there are tons of threats. Road building, obviously one of them. We would categorize that as habitat destruction. So habitat destruction is a leading threat to all species. Well, not all species, but the vast majority of species that are imperiled are facing some level of habitat destruction. But there are other threats as well. One of them is also pesticides. And Matt mentioned, we all know that honeybees are imperiled by pesticides, but native bees even more so because they don't have the buffer of the hive. At least solitary bees don't have the buffer of the hive. There's also climate change. They face unusual heat events, unusual storms. Many native bees are exquisitely adapted to just one or two flowers. And so if that flower is late blooming and that bee is out, that bee doesn't have any food. And many bees actually share a name with their flower. That's how close their relationship is. So any kind of climate chaos that messes with that timing can have a really significant impact. And disease. So disease can come from commercial bees. Disease can come from honeybees gone into the wild and spreading disease. And there are some natural diseases out there as well. And all of these threats are compounded by the other threats. So take, for example, pesticides. One of the pesticide classes that most imperils bees is neonicotinoids. Neonicotinoids are a neurotoxic insecticide, and so they cause all the impacts to bees that you'd expect someone affected by neurotoxins to experience. So confusion, disorientation, they might get lost, and they eat less, which means they end up with lower body weight. And so you have a low body weight bee that now is facing an unseasonable storm and it can't go out and forage. Well, that bee might not have as good of a chance of surviving. Same if there's a threat like a wasp, it won't do as good of a job fighting it off, or a disease. Another pesticide threat is use of herbicides just kills off the forage that these bees need. And so all of these things are interconnected. That use of the pesticide makes what should be habitat not actually usable habitat. So we have a lot going to protect our native bees right now. One of the things that we do, and one of the things that all of you folks who love the center should know, is that we utilize the strongest conservation law we have, the Endangered Species Act. So we have woefully few bees that have the protection of the Endangered Species Act, and we're working to change that. We have submitted comprehensive petitions for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to protect the Mojave poppy bee, the Suckley's bumblebee, and the Gulf Coast solitary bee. I could spend the next hour telling you about each of these species. Each one of them is amazing and faces its own unique threats. And each of them can be saved if we just put a little muscle to protecting them. And these bees represent an interesting swatch of bees because, like you mentioned, Tira, some of these bees live in just a tiny little patch of habitat, and it is so important that we protect them if we want to keep them on this earth. And some of them are much more wide-ranging and should be generalists and should be doing fine, but because of the landscape level threats they're facing, they're really not doing well at all. We also battle threats on public land, like working to protect the Grand Staircase National Monument. Another threat that they face on public lands is the placement of commercial honeybee apiaries. Honeybees, as Matt mentioned, are kind of like livestock in that they are raised and produced to do specific things for humans. They're not native to here. And like livestock, they can cause unintended impacts. Unfortunately, honeybees are greatly imperiled by pesticides. And so beekeepers are looking for pesticide-free places to put their bees. And increasingly, they're turning to federal public land. And with so little knowledge of the importance of native bees and what they, their hot spots, what they eat, honeybees are being sort of placed all over on our federal public lands with a rubber stamped process called categorical exclusions. So we've teamed up with a number of other groups to ask the Bureau of Land Management and the U.S. Forest Service to actually do an environmental assessment when they are considering applications to place commercial bee apiaries on our federal public lands. And we also do a lot of work on pesticides. It's going to take a little bit of time for us to reverse climate change, but when we know a pesticide is directly causing massive bee population level die-offs, there's no reason why we should not be banning that pesticide. And the EPA's pesticide office has a recklessly permissive approach to pesticide regulation that fails to protect our bees. So we comment on every single application for pesticides or risk assessment that we can where there's significant environmental impacts. And we bring quite a bit of litigation against EPA's pesticide office for their continuous refusal to consider the impacts to bees and other species under the Endangered Species Act, for their failed cost benefit analyses that only look at the benefits of pesticides and don't look at the harms that they're causing in our society. And then we also are supporting legislation that would overhaul our pesticide laws so that we can actually look at the impacts they're having and properly assess whether we need these pesticides to stay on the market. So, like Matt said, our native bees are absolutely essential to keeping our ecosystems alive and functioning. I don't know about you, but I don't want to live in a world where there's not a big super bloom event every few years. I don't want to live in a world where there aren't wild blueberries. I don't want to live in a world without wildflower meadows. And we need our native bees for all of those.
Thanks, Lori Ann.
Yeah.
So now let's get to some questions that are pouring in. We've saved a lot of time for this. Fun question for Matt. Matt, how did you get your filming equipment up the mountain?
I got it up the mountain with a big old backpack and my 2 feet. Fortunately, we had very light equipment. I shot Tony DeZino, who is a good friend of mine and who was my director of photography for this, had a dedicated, what you'd recognize as a film camera for something like this. I had a DSLR where I could do still photos and film on it. So we were traveling pretty light. He also carried his drone up to the top so we could get drone shots from the top. But it was a long day. It was a long day.
Another question for you, Matt. Do you think that your film could be used as an advocacy tool to get the government to put the protections back in place for the monument now that you've documented all the special bees that live there?
Yes.
Okay. Another question for you. Most people, a lot of people on this webinar excluded, a lot of people don't care about insects or are afraid of bees in general. How do you get people like spread awareness that bees are good?
That is a great question. And I think that one of the best ways to do it is by working with kids. I think so much of the response to insects or bees or spiders or any of these great invertebrates is just kind of ingrained habit. I mean, literally, you're bigger than all these things. I don't know why you're afraid of them, right? Like if you just want to kind of boil it down to that. So I think connecting with kids is a great way to do it. I think kids are naturally curious. They are happy to get into gross things that we as adults perceive are gross. And they very much mimic what we do as adults, whether they're our own children or whether they're, students, other children that we work with. So I really think that's the best way to approach the issue. But with adults, I think making films like this makes a huge difference. I think getting up close and really showing people how beautiful these things are. It's the beauty, it's the aesthetics that I think win people over initially. The segment in the film where it's the red bee and the green bee and was probably the first set of images I created for this film 2 years ago. And it has lived throughout the entire process. 90% of the stuff that I created was out. But that's stuff that lived on because every time I showed it, you could see jaws drop. People are like, and you're like, yeah, man, bees, like they're super cool. It was the image, it was the aesthetic of the bees that really won people over.
For sure. Looking at the beginning of that, I had no idea bees came in so many sizes and shapes and colors. That was really cool. This question is probably for Taylor. With the new administration, do you think the boundaries of the monument can be restored?
Yeah, absolutely. And the way that Trump attacked the original boundary was to issue a new proclamation that was smaller. And Biden could certainly issue a new proclamation that reestablishes the original boundary. So, his legal authority to do that is very clear.
Here's sort of a more technical question that references something Matt brought up in the film. Is it possible, and if so, when, for the Bureau of Land Management to revise the record of decision for the monument so that it acknowledges and incorporates protections for bees and other invertebrates? Taylor, Lori Ann, Matt?
I'm not sure I have an answer to that. I know that what you saw in the film is that the new monument plans were just published and released. The management plans were published and released in February of this year. I would presume that the straightest line would be a new declaration or a new proclamation reestablishing the original boundaries, which I think would then require new management plans to be established. Does that seem like the straightest line there?
Taylor?
we don't want to speculate on that too much because of our litigation. It actually touches on our litigation, and this will be a public video. But any future revision to a resource management plan would absolutely provide an opportunity to bolster protections for bees, and mind you, bees and species and diversity of bees that we collectively weren't aware of when the even the original resource management plan was written.
And also in regards to the litigation, are there any protections in place while it's pending?
Kind of a sticky question, but the new resource management plans that were promulgated for the reduced Trump-sized monument area are far less protective than what existed before. So there are some protections, but it's a far cry from what it should be in terms of the size of the monument and also the substance of the management.
Another question asking about the future, Lori Ann, with changes coming to the EPA, do you think there'll be more protections from pesticides for native pollinators?
We sure hope so. Like Matt mentioned, a lot of the study of impacts of pesticides have been on honeybees, and they've refused to look at the impacts on native bees. And obviously that's something we push very hard for, and hopefully we'll find more receptive ears. It's certainly a priority for us.
Matt, there's an interesting question about endemic plants. So like sometimes native bees have a plant that they're dependent on. Is there been research, or did you document that in the monument between these bees and special plants there?
When Olivia and Joe go out to collect, every time they collect a bee, they collect the flower it's on. So they always document the relationship as well. That is actually something that Olivia is extraordinarily interested in. She's a flower person. She does a lot of document of that. I couldn't speak to that specifically, but it is something that they look at when they do their research.
I don't know if you guys are experts on this. Are there other groups of very special flora and fauna in that monument? Taylor, you've written a lot of comments. You probably know that one.
Yeah, there's a lot of endemism in this monument, and interestingly, it's and you read this in the proclamation. Floristically, it's one of the most diverse areas in the Intermountain West, and that probably owes to its geographic position and its diversity of elevational gradients and different habitats there. But it's thinking about pollinator ecology. Its floristic diversity. Given its floristic diversity, it's the bee diversity, for example, makes sense. And I think of the the studies that have been referenced and featured in the movie as perhaps the tip of the iceberg in terms of biodiversity study in Grand Staircase. I think there's a lot more biodiversity to be learned there by science, and it's very exciting and it's very beautiful also. Each one of those species' story, its natural history is a fascinating window into life.
And it actually raises something I would love people to walk away from this movie thinking about, which is, Matt alluded to and the movie alludes to, which is like, what is habitat? And I'll just be real for a second. Not all parts of Grand Staircase-Escalante are spectacularly beautiful. There are places that just look like piles of rocks and dirt. There are a lot of places like that. And I think that was some of the rhetoric around cutting back the monument, was like this isn't that spectacular, these places that we're cutting out. Yeah, sure, we'll save the fancy rock formations, but like, why this dirt and rock? And that dirt and rock is incredibly important habitat for so many species that live nowhere else on Earth. And so, you know, we need to open our eyes to what's important and stop, you know, like, it's very easy to see a lush brook and think, okay, this is important habitat. It's harder to see some dirt and rocks from a distance and understand its value. And so it really requires us to look deeper and to think about all the creatures that we often overlook.
How can people help support and protect native bees where they live?
So I'll take this one. As more of our rural lands are experiencing a higher and higher pesticide load and a higher toxic load from agriculture, urban gardens and suburban gardens are increasingly important for providing native bee habitat. So growing a variety of native plants, plants that bloom for as long of a season as you can possibly have bloom. So you're providing food throughout the season, not using pesticides, talking to your neighbors about not using pesticides, making sure the nursery you buy your plants from isn't using pesticides because you don't want to be poisoning your bees as they visit your flowers. And right now, it's extremely important to leave your garden alone. So I know there's a strong urge to go tidy up before winter comes, but all those stems and leaves can be providing really important habitat. So please leave them.
Matt, you probably have some thoughts on this too, what people can do to help protect native bees where they live.
Yeah, you know, Lori Ann really hit the high points on it. Just to dig down into some of the details, we think about planting flowers and these plants for bees to forage on, but it's the nesting spots that they need too. One of the super cool community science activities going right now is called Queen's Quest, because bumblebees, for example, are semi-social, right? They have a queen. They're not quite like honeybees, but they have a community that they build around a queen. They typically are perennial like honeybees are. They're more annual. But we don't know where, by and large, we don't know where bumblebee queens nest. And we don't know where, you know, how do they overwinter? How do they come back? It's almost like Aristotle, you know, thousands of years ago saying, oh, birds, we didn't know they migrated. We thought they just went underground. Well, bees actually do that. And, but we don't know where, we don't know how, we don't know when. So if we don't know those things, how do we protect those things, right? The Queen's Quest activity is super cool. I think the other thing to think about is connectivity. Small patches, your backyard can really be a pristine place, which in many ways can be as valuable as a place like Grand Staircase on a smaller scale. You can provide, bees can, a tremendous number of bees can live in a small patch. I was reminded of this at we have a music festival, or we had in previous years a musical festival out here in Western New York. And we were walking, you know, it's on this beautiful kind of like rural country area. And we were walking through the area that they had mowed for the parking lot. And somebody had been a little off when they'd been mowing, and there was like a single plant like sticking up where it had just kept growing. And of course I stop and look at it, right? And there are literally hundreds of bees, teeny tiny sweat bees on this thing foraging. So if a single plant in a single, you know, grassy field can do that, imagine what a well thought out backyard can do. And then think about the fact that if you do it and your neighbor does it and more neighbors do it, and you create all this connectivity through all these different microhabitats, we're suddenly creating not only a bigger space collectively, but ways for bees to move back and forth, because a lot of bees are going to need, you know, to be able to migrate with things like climate change. So connectivity is a cool thing to think about.
Are there other citizen science projects that people could get involved with native bees?
Yeah, mainly they focus on bumblebees because those are the ones that are easiest for people to see and identify. So there's queensquest.org and there is Bumblebee Watch, which is super cool. But the other place you can go is iNaturalist.org, and it's basically how do I mean, if you've never been to iNaturalist, it's basically a social networking site for biodiversity nerds like all of us. Like you can document all this great stuff you're seeing, whether it's slime mold or whales and everything in between, and you upload it, and you may not know what it is, but there are tons of experts on there who are going to identify this. And then scientists can end up using this stuff to actually do biodiversity, like legitimate science. It's not just throwing things into the ether, it's legitimately contributing to science. And then conversely, you can learn so much in return from it. So if you're just out in the backyard shooting photos of bees on your, your little mobile phone, start throwing them on iNaturalist. It's helpful. It's great. It's great stuff.
People are curious if you're going to make another film and what it's going to be about.
I will need to ask my wife about that, because this this was a lot of conversation between me and her. But no, at some point I will make another film. I don't know how soon it will be, and I actually don't know if it'll focus on bees. There's a couple other topics that I'm really interested in, and I think would be equally important to cover. So at some point.
In terms of this film, if somebody watching wants to host a showing, how do they do that? How do they get in touch with you?
They can go to any number of websites that I have, but bymattkelly.com. And I think that I've put my email in the about section. One way or another, bymattkelly.com or beesofgsenm.com, and you can get in touch with me through those websites.
So we have time for just a couple more questions. Taylor, is there like a macro thing that needs to happen so that each new administration doesn't change the boundaries of the monuments?
Well, we could stop electing people like Donald Trump would be a good macro trend, but not to be snarky, but Congress intended the law the Antiquities Act to run in one direction, and that was for the creation of national monuments. Congress did not intend or write the law in a way that for presidents to run it in reverse. It's a one-way law. Conceivably there could be a legislative reinforcement to the Antiquities Act if and when Congress is amenable to that in the future. But for now, I think our eyes are going to stay on the prize, which is to ensure that the Biden administration makes good on its promise to reestablish the original boundary here at Grand Staircase. But the macro policy question's a good one, and it's good to think about those things, because we are often, as here in the trenches, in the face of an administration like Trump's, holding the line with lawsuits and organizing and administrative challenges just to maintain the status quo.
We're doing a lot of thinking about ending extinction at the macro level, and we're grateful to all of you for joining us and for your support. We're out of time for tonight, but thank you, Lori Ann and Matt and Taylor, and thank you to you at home. We will be on Slack tomorrow in the Endangered Species channel from noon to 1 Pacific if you want to continue the conversation. And you're going to get an email right after this with a 24-hour pass to the film and an action alert with an action that you can take to help protect more habitat for wildlife. So thank you for joining us, and take care.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.